Welcome to the Path of Fearlessness, Lesson 2. What was Lesson 1? Talked about anxiety, depression, panic, and framing those as experiences within a fearlessness paradigm. What is the fearlessness paradigm is the learning journey. It's all about learning, as I end that first video. So your task in Lesson 2 is number 1, go back and rewatch Lesson 1 video. Not because I want you to be staring at me all the time and listening to me, although it's somewhat useful perhaps. It's for you to practice a practice that shows your commitment to and your choice to walk the path of fearlessness through these video series. Okay. So that's your first part. That's repeat. Repetition works. Go back to video 1, teaching your education, as they call it, 1, and study it. Re-watch even just for a few minutes, not even have to start at the beginning. So that is your practice for what you're entering as part of Lesson 2. Got it? Lesson 2 is go back and watch Lesson 1 over, study it, about that path of fearlessness, how we're shaping it, how I am bringing to you some different orientation, a fearlessness orientation to the problems. I just said we'll call it anxiety, disorders, dis-ease from now on. All right, so Lesson 2, let's move on. Oh, and to study that video, also study the comments that are in the video and any discussion, and place your own discussion in that. Do journaling on things you're learning and share it in the comments below that video. And same with this one. That's part of the practice. I then can respond more specifically to specific things that might intrigue you or just things you share, questions you have. Okay. Lesson 2, let's move on. I summarize Lesson 1 in a very simple way, and there's obviously many summaries to it. Lesson 1 is saying you're not alone. Lesson 2 is saying you're in a great mystery. And that mystery reminds you that you're not alone. So I'm going to use the whiteboard today and move into that. A couple of diagrams that I've used over the years from a fearlessness perspective of the path that will remind you both of the mystery and how the mystery reminds you you're not alone. That's kind of the logic for it. I'm helping bring a new map to your venture, adventure, your inventure, your life tasks to walk the path of fearlessness, moving out of that fear-based paradigm. Okay, so before I do that, I'm just going to use this as a little introduction, because some people might be thinking about, well, should I be doing yoga? Should I be, developing a spiritual practice? Should I be doing breathing exercises when I'm, feeling panicky? Well, I'm not going to be doing a lot of techniques in this series. That is not how a fearlessness perspective focuses. There are so many articles, books, videos, talks available to you at no cost to show you, guide you, let you read, practices, techniques dealing with anxiety, right? Depression, panic. So I won't be doing that here unless you ask. If you ask specific questions in the comments below, I will help you there. So I'm going to start with images, thoughts, ideas, part of the philosophic tradition, the philosophia toward the path. The path of knowledge is the path of fearlessness. The path of philosophy as a therapia is the path that I am focusing on. So let's just start with an image. It's kind of like a poster. I found this badge in a friend's bathroom when I was visiting her one day, and I said, "This is a great badge. Do you mind if I take it?" This was like 10 years ago. And she said, "Sure, go ahead." She had collected these political activist badges, and I thought this was the best one. She had hundreds of them. I thought, well, this one's the best. I'd love to have it, so I'll share it with you. Look at that. So you can take that for your homework, part of your homework for lesson 2. And I'm going to retranslate that, the words in that badge, to: do you love wisdom of knowledge more or less than you love your symptoms? You can contemplate on that. And another part you can contemplate for homework as well is: what is anxiety? Question mark. That's an inquiry knowledge path. All right, let's move on to the 2 diagrams, and I'll do a screen share. Get my drawing tools out here. So let's just call them 2 maps, and I have many that I've used over the years for the path of fearlessness. These are about reorienting our relationality. So I'm using relationality here. Get the right drawing tool. Which one? I've used this for a while. I think it's this one here. No, trying to get the squiggly drawing one. This one should give me what I want. Yay. Using relationality here. So reorienting, see the re and see the re. This re is very important in the idea of returning. So these maps I'm going to show you are about, oh, Michael is showing us a way to return. Keep that in mind. And there's a lot of terms, right, that could go with this re that I've really liked. You can think of more, but recovery is a basic one. Anyone who's addicted has addictive processes, right? Obsessions, etc. At some point, could be you're an alcoholic or drug addict of some kind, or so on, being labeled as such. Of course, that's not who you are, but it's what you're practicing. So I've always said that anyone who's practicing these kinds of problems or symptoms, that they are part of recovery itself. So everything's trying to recover. Well, what's it trying to recover from? Everything psychologically, I'm just saying, in nature is trying to recover from distress. There's at least one word you can use in your own vocabulary. Distress, fear-based, patterning, etc. That's what you're trying to recover from. And that's part of life, right? Distress creates anxiety, anxiousness, fear-based thinking, behaviors, and ultimately the system has to recover. I kind of say it's like, Distress is like the system's going up into hyper mode, and at some point it has to come back and recover. It has to return. It's called the process of homeostasis, of recovery back to a kind of a harmony and equilibrium, whatever you want. So relationality, to get back to that point I've made here, relationality, I'm really interested in the development of relationality as fundamental to all therapia, as fundamental to your relationship with knowledge, your relationality with knowledge, wisdom, and of course yourself. But here's the terms that I like to use as a basic notion for relationality: self, other, peer, relationship. My psychology of fearlessness perspective is basically that everything we can pretty much understand is a relationship of the self to the other, which is not the self, however that's identified. And therefore, in that relationship, there's always going to be some fear. Put anxiety there for the moment if you wish. All right, so that is a whole. I, in other words, never want to talk about the self unless I'm talking about the other. I never want to talk about the other out there or objects, whatever, without talking about the self. I never want to talk about fear without talking about the other and the self. So let me just draw what I mean by that. In other words, don't separate them. They overlap. They're connected to each other intimately, and that flows into that, and that flows into that, and that flows into that, and that flows into that. And notice this lovely relational patterning that I'm creating here. Well, that's the mess of what we are. And that is much more useful than thinking that I am a me out there. I'm basically saying, well, yeah, you have a me part of you, but that is a very isolated, cut off little box that you've created if you think that's who you are. If I'm a I, right, is another way to say it's not just the me, but it's the I am, right, etc., me, all about the self. Well, that kind of boxing in is just going to lead to a lot of over exacerbated narcissism, basically, and self obsession. And all your disease symptoms or dis-ease symptoms of distress, right, that I've talked about over here, will be definitely related to a box that's kind of like a wheel, also just spinning upon itself. And pretty much that's all neurosis. Okay, let's label that, move that over a bit. No, gotta get the right drawing tools. I haven't learned this program for a while, but that's all neurosis. Okay, this mess here. This mess over here, this lovely holistic integral diagram of self, other, and fear, that is not neurosis. Sounds good? Okay, it's just a basic part of the mapping of the path of fearlessness. I wanted to get that straight of when I talk about relationality, return, recovery processes as part of the healing journey, that they are all about reorienting. And so any kind of movement that you have, moving from this direction of neurosis to not neurosis, that's along the path of fearlessness. Right? That's a choice. Moving out of this isolation that gets caused over here. Let's put the word down just to the isolation of that, right? Which is what lesson 1 I said, you're not alone. So the isolation thing is I am alone. And there's some reality and truth to being alone, and aloneness itself is an important part of the path of fearlessness, let me tell you, because you have to unhook from the masses of society, of the social norms, the conformity that wants to pull you into this is how you're supposed to be because we are like that, and you should be like us, and that's called culture. And I will talk about the problem of culture, um, maybe in this video, maybe not, but we'll get to it. The culture, what it's telling you, right? That it wants to control who you are, what you're supposed to be. And I have pretty much proven, I say proven very gently, as many researchers are talking about the culture of fear now, that we live in a culture of fear. So keep that in mind, our attachment to culture. Not saying all culture is bad and horrible and fear-based, but the mass majority of it in this time, I'm going to say very clearly in history, 21st century is a culture of fear. And arguably that culture of fear goes back thousands of years. Another story, another video, ask me if you're interested in that history. So we're understanding here, right, in this video, this self-fear other referent is, we're attempting to unhook it, go to a larger concept that I've shown here in this mass. So it's a much more holistic, integral concept that will help us to move along the path in this direction. And sometimes we'll slip back and we'll go into this patterning. Absolutely, it's been around forever, so it's a conditioning, and then you got to find the way to path and slip back out, and sometimes you'll circle around, and eventually, if you practice the practices of fearlessness and keep looking at the orienting map I'm giving you, or others that are giving you on the path of fearlessness, you'll eventually not go back so far each time you fall off the path, and all of that, recovery work. So this big mess down here, that's all part of recovery work. That's what it looks like. And as I say, there is a progression going here. All right, so the next, I'm going to clean this in a second, but I'm just going to put over here love to remind us when I go into the next diagram. Two more diagrams, actually. I realized there'd be three. Very briefly, though, that direction, that's basically the direction of love. And that's not a love not just identified or defined or made meaning by the culture. Got it? Right? This old cultural patterning over here. Most of it, which is all in this camp of this stuff, we're reorienting to, really, you could call it a new culture, a cultural revolution of consciousness in this direction called the path of fearlessness towards, let's just call it love if you want a nice simple symbol. But it is not the cultural definition per se. It includes and integrates that, but transcends that definition. All right. All right, so I'm up here, I can clear all drawings. So next, let's do the two quick diagrams. I probably can just do them, drawing tool back. I'll do them with very simple and quick, because this is the path of knowledge, as I said earlier. So in here, at the center core of your inquiry, so I'm mapping right now what I'm asking you to think about in a holistic, integral, relational paradigm, which is essential to the fearlessness model, rather than that self-isolating one. Let's just make it with three basic differential parts to it. It's supposed to be all the same, more or less in size. They're all equally important spheres. And this one I'm just going to call the knowledge of morals. This one is the knowledge of self. And this one is the knowledge of science. So where self is, you could put psychology, you could put connected to sciences, biology, physiology of the self, etc., etc., etc. Where's art? In this model, I like to put art here. So I could put many terms for each of these sections. Um, sometimes it's done like this, integral model. This is the we perspective over here. Um, this is the I perspective over here. And this is the it perspective. Down in there, in that sphere. Okay. Different perspectives of knowledge. I, it, we. Perspectives is everything, folks. Philosophy, so how I sort of see it is when I'm trying to work in knowledges, learning, study in this kind of domain, I want to take those into philosophy as the center. I won't say more about philosophy than so on, and then let philosophy feed that information back to me. When I'm studying morals, religion, culture, the we perspective, how I understand that as part of reality, take that knowledge into philosophy, let philosophy work with it, and then return it. Same in the perspective of working with science knowledge as another approach to reality. Let philosophy, impact that knowledge. So I guess I would go from this direction and then return. So that's ongoing. But here's the emphasis, isn't it? The philosophia that we're doing, not therapy, but therapia, or at least more therapia than therapy. It's really not about excluding or creating an artificial dualism between therapy and therapia. I said that in the first video. So this philosophia practice in here, this is the path of knowledge. That's the path of fearlessness. And basically it's because, let's put a little ring around here as a symbolic idea of this diagram. Remember, this represents reality. It's not reality. It's a map of reality. So this sphere here is kind of an insulating, I called it insulating. It's kind of the truthing zone of reality. And philosophy, philosophia, in the larger sense of a fearlessness philosophy, is always the refresher, the core return place that then, again, it's connected to and goes back into this world out here. So outside of this sort of buffer of this philosophia work that's going on in here, all of this out here, that's based more or less in a culture of fear. Here. Or what I've also called, and you can look up my work further on this, a fear matrix. Okay. Really cannot figure out how to move these words, but that's okay. So what you're doing in this sphere around philosophia is attempting to return to fearlessness. So that our knowledge and our identity that is built out here through knowledge of the I, we, it perspective, science, art, and morals, that's going to be invaded, that knowledge, by fear if you're not vigilant. There's conditioning, there's unconsciousness of fear-based patterning, and that it will create anxiety from many directions. So I'm not even talking here, right, about very specific things that cause anxiety out in the big world out here, like global warming, right, like wars, like pandemics, and so on, death. I'm talking about here is a methodology and the mapping of methodology for knowledge. And I'm showing you a way to go out into that world and be in that world, which we live most of the time, and then have a path that you can go into to the philosophia and then come back out. And that is the refresher. I think the next diagram, it's very much similar. Um, and it starts, so it's going to be similar to the one I just showed you. It's going to have love at that end, up there, and fear at this end. And this is going to be called the dialectic map. And the map I just showed of the culture of fear and fearlessness, this philosophia over here, is another dialectic map of another kind, but this is the real simple version that is kind of very similar to the map I just showed you of an approach. And so my argument is that, and this is how we ought to think about and organize our relations of love to fear. Now, some people say, well, you're talking about emotions here, and this is about feelings. And I say, well, no, not necessarily. It could include love feelings, it could include emotions. But when I use love and fear, I'm using them in really a philosophical orientation. And that comes from my research that love and fear are often seen as opposites in many languages. I'm seeing here, I just need to do a quick erase here of that. I made a mistake with, of course, is at that end for sure. And it's fear down here, which is the negative, so-called. Right, that's the mistake I made. I wanted to put a negative sign down there. So that life is composed of positives, if you just think in the general way, and positives tend to become negative, and then negative things can move to positive things. And that's a whole movement, right? It's a whole relationality. And you can see all of the 3 diagrams I've shown so far about whole reality as a whole, and how to keep it whole so that we don't get stuck in that neurotic part. And I'll show you on this map a little bit more how that neurosis patterning, fear-based patterning, gets set up. So I'm saying basically, don't make one totally good, totally bad. Love is all good, fear is all bad. I'm not saying that. You could put good up here instead of love, and you could put evil down here, right? These polarities. Well, a dialectic map says you don't want to do that. That's going to give you an skewed sense of anxiety as well, because you're always thinking that love's competing with fear, or fear is competing with love, and you get caught in the anxiety of that loss of love, sorry. It's always going to be driving down. And I'm saying, yeah, we want to avoid those kind of competitive, dualistic patterns. So the dialectic map, contradicts dualism mapping or thinking. So we're changing our thinking at a fearless path. It's a choice to change my way of thinking about reality, the world, my self-identity, and the way I come to knowledge in that world. Yeah, that's the good news. You can create that by remapping and reorienting. So to finish this diagram, which really finishes this talk for the most part, everything's going to change. What's positive is eventually going to move toward negative orientation. What's negative orientation can and will equally move to positive, except we can get stuck. So if this was yourself moving from, let's just say, a state of love to a state of fear, I would just say keep going with it. Keep going with the fear. Yeah, you can call it negative. It's not pleasant in its worst sides. But just to remember, eventually, the whole design of nature, creation, that's my thesis here, without going into that huge argument of evolution, it will eventually move back to love in some kind of way. Now, what gets interesting is if you get down in here, and then you say, I really don't want to get more fear because I'm really afraid that that's what will happen. You sort of get stuck in identifying in a fear-based self way. And the reason is because you're not familiar with the diagram that's dialectic like this that says, hey, just keep going. It eventually will take you back onto this path toward love again. Okay? So that's one loop. Well, these loops occur all over. So let's make another loop. I'm having this love experience, let's say, and I go, oh, I'm going down again. I remember this. This is depression, or this is, my anxiety, or whatever, or you have a really bad day, or whatever. And you just do want to do everything not to go down. And so you'll try to come back to that love positive experience. Oh, I want to get back to that peaceful state. I want to get back to that love. I want to get back to that goodness. And then you try to create a loop there. Well, just notice what you're doing is creating I call it off grid, but it's a different kind of off grid than the eco people. You're off grid from the natural path of life. It's natural path. And you create actually a off-centered place in a vacuum, and your whole center of self starts to orient in these little neurotic loops that I've just made here. And you can also do it in this loop is, I'm moving back to love, and from having gone through this fear experience, and you go, oh, I don't want to go back to love. I got too hurt in my last love relationship, so I think I'm just going to kind of hang out here, not too much. I'd rather be in some fear and cautiousness, and then go back to love and be open again and have my heart broken again. So I'm just giving a few really simple examples, but diagrammatically, this is why I think this diagram is a very useful model to see where you can also get stuck in another neurotic loop in avoiding love in that sense. All right, but here's what I want to finish the diagram with. And these should really be dashed lines. They're open lines, they're porous boundaries. And so I call this area or zone here as the fearlessness zone. And I just diagrammatically see it as sort of halfway between these two polarities. And that fearlessness zone is where, similar to this philosophia zone over here, it's the kind of buffering and repair zone. It's the zone that helps us to not just go from extremes. And so basically, if I feel myself going down, right, like from a love state or a positive good state, I can either do a loop up here to try and get back to that, or I can say, okay, well, I'm just going to, let myself go down, and eventually I'm going to make a decision right here. This is the key point of diagram of where I make a decision to go into the fearlessness teachings, the fearlessness practices. Oh, some of the stuff that Dr. Fisher's talking about. Yeah, some of that. And that's where I do my fearlessness work, in that zone. And so I can kind of spin around in this zone, and it's a lot healthier than spinning in these zones out here. And because you can more connected, you can see you're so connected to the whole when you're in the fearlessness zone. And then at some point, just diagrammatically, you go back on this path. And you kind of get nourished there, right? As in that down cycle from love, and you even find trust in there. Right? It's kind of a trust zone. Another way to find it, and you find that trust zone through your connection to nature, culture, and spirituality. Is another talk I could give at some point. You won't find it just in culture. You won't find it just in yourself. You'll have to find it in the natural world, the cultural world, and the spiritual world, and in another integral kind of way, holistic way. So let's get the sense of that fearlessness zone working there, and then the same when you're rising up here, and you might have a tendency to think, oh, I don't want to go back fully to love. It's just go back into the fearlessness zone and say, okay, time to go back into that practice, that understanding, and then come back out, and then you'll, just like you're going to get oxygen. I sort of use the analogy when we're in distress, we need oxygen, and sometimes we can't get it from ourselves. We need to get it from a loving other place. And if you can have other people practicing fearlessness with you, then you can share knowledge and you can share how to get back on that path of fearlessness when you need to remember. And then even there's techniques and ideas about how to get back, let the fearlessness go a bit again and then get back on this path of life, which we have to live between the positives and the negatives, the reality principle in a way. Okay. All right, well, this is enough for today. So I'll just stop share. As I end, I've given you a few mapping orientations. And so review this video, that's part of lesson 2. But lesson 2 basically is creating the mystery of change, transformation, growth, right, development, and who we are, who I am, what it is. That I, it, we, integral perspective, which was in video 1 and in video 2 now, but I've given you some nuancing of moving that between love and fear, for example, which I think is a very useful model. I find it continually useful in my thinking, my writing, my sharing, and my own practices in relational with the I, the it, the we. And obviously, with my close relationships, that's applicable too. How do I move? What are my patterns and habits, and how can I create this fearlessness zone? And that's what we're doing here, right? A fearlessness therapia. We're creating that zone that moves between all polarities and gives us a place to go into instead of just being caught in polarities and then neurotic loops that try to avoid the opposite pole. Well, that is a huge shift, folks. That is another reality. That's another world that we can create, a whole different evolution for ourselves and consciousness. Thanks very much for this today. Look forward to your comments, and let's continue that conversation. I'm not alone. I am in the mystery. Lesson 1, lesson 2.